Good morning. Really honored to be asked to speak on behalf of the Shkamami Project. I know Ramona Baxter's out there, and she's lucky I'm not pulling her up here because she was one of, there she is over there. That's Ramona Baxter. She was one of the leads in starting this project and in wrapping our ways around them, which hopefully some of you have seen. The Nk'Ka'pamith Nation Tribal Council has very graciously offered it free online, which started the Shkamami Project. And really what happened was that our offices were getting calls from the nation about children being taken, continuing to be taken into care, and really the families not being represented appropriately culturally or in any way, as well as the communities wanting to intervene in those cases. So what the elders did, what the Nk'Ka'pamith did, was have us attend court on, which many of you probably are familiar with, one day where it's predominantly Indigenous families and children in the court making decisions about temporary custody, interim custody, some continuing custody orders. And the observation that the Nk'Ka'pamith made was that many of the Nk'Ka'pamith families that were there were basically alone. And so in sitting with that, going back to the community and sitting with it, sitting with the elders said that it reminded them of this image right here. It's Hell's Gate. When the railway was going through the canyon, they blew up significant amounts of the canyon to make way for that track. And in doing so, they blocked the Fraser River just when at the height of the salmon run. And so the Nk'Ka'pamith, as well as their neighbors, the Stalo, Sa'im, and others, they brought their baskets and they brought their blankets and they brought buckets and they brought whatever they could and to help the salmon over the landslide and the rock slide. And they said that's what was happening to our families and our children in the court process. We're stuck. We're under foreign governments, their justice system. It's justice by strangers. We have to take that back. Somehow we have to intervene in real and significant ways. And if it's taking our baskets and our blankets and our arms, we have to help our families and our children. So this started the Shkamami Project, and in that there was the elders, the community people, the traditional knowledge keepers all came together and started to look for what they called the justice trail. That's Nk'Ka'pamith laws in Nk'Ka'pamith stories, origin stories, and others. So these were some of the stories that were looked at to find those principles that really represent Nk'Ka'pamith ways of being. And you said earlier at the opening, these are relational laws. So it was drawing those principles from Coyote and Rabbit, from Skalula, from the boy who was abandoned, and what did that mean? And it was quite profound in the principles that they drew out. They're responding in real ways to issues that have confronted our communities since, contact, really, and the legacy of colonialism that continues to impact our families today. So they drew those principles out and found that they respond in modern times to significant issues like domestic violence, abuse, neglect, all of those what they call the monsters. There's a story in there about the monsters and how the people and the animals came together to confront the monsters that were challenging their communities. And from that, then they said, well, we're going to draw on these legal principles, and then we're going to take a look and see, put our minds to what can we do for our children and our families who are really basically radically disconnected. Sometimes their ties are completely severed. And we're going to try and hold up our own laws, stand up our own laws, and use those to intervene. What we were faced with, though, of course, is that we are all having to deal with legislation. We're all having to deal with colonial governments, colonial laws that are imposed on us that don't often hear the voice of Indigenous communities, nations, and children. So we said, okay, so what's the next step we have to do? And they said, okay, well, we have to look at the legislation itself, because those are promises. There's promises in there made to Indigenous children, to Nklaka'pamith children, to our people. And if we interpret those laws in ways that are healing, are focused on wellness, focused on the health of the child and restoration, if they look at it as relational laws, what would that look like? And that's what Wrapping Our Ways did. It looked at the laws and it said, okay, what's the difference between Western courts and law and our own Nklaka'pamith ways of doing things? And of course, they found that the courts are not really appropriate forums for families. They're not healing. They're not about bringing people together. There's a winner, there's a loser, there's adversarial positions. And really, they're decisions made by an external body that, and that's what we learned about justice by strangers. They don't know who our families are. They don't know who the kids are. And, but they're making decisions that will profoundly impact that child moving forward into their lives. Because we know once a decision is made at any single point, it's like a train leaving a station and it'll just build steam. So they said, okay, so let's look at that. The other difference, of course, is that time, there's a finality, there's permanency, there's certainty. The Western way of doing this was about we have to have a definite answer. It's in the best interest of these children that we need an answer today for their safety. But it was like the operation was successful, but the patient died. For many of us 60 scoop survivors who are in this room, probably we would say that that really reflects our experience. So we started to look at our own laws then in relation to that and say, okay, well, if we looked at their laws as relational laws and said if they were relationship-oriented, well, what would that look like? Let's stand up Nklaka'pamith laws. So those laws being to people, to lands, and to waters. If there is an us and them, the them is the children, and they take precedence over everything. And then focusing on how the healing needs to happen, creating cohesive relationships and wrapping that around the children. The other thing that was different was that everybody who comes to the process has responsibility and accountability, and it's there for the life of the child for as long as that child needs them. And that was the Nklaka'pamith elders were saying. So time didn't really factor into it. The circle, the process, those relationships become lifetime relationships. And we focused on the strengths. So it's not judging, winning and losing, but saying, okay, what's the strengths here? And understanding, for example, in some of the cases we had where grandmothers maybe who had been to residential school themselves, had gone through a lot of heartbreak, had been broken, but had healed, but were not considered to be an appropriate placement, for example, because of this history. And what we did was say, well, that's not the way that we look at people. We think then that grandmother has wisdom. She has healed, and she can bring that to their family. So the focus was on her strengths rather than on any of her past history. So that was one of the bigger differences. It draws on the child's own culture and Nklaka'pamith laws and worldviews, and participants that are brought into the circle. In here, for example, the Western there's the nuclear family, but in the Nklaka'pamith mind, as the elders were telling us, is it's beyond extended family, right? It's also the elders, it's also the cultural people, the people who have the knowledge, the people we would traditionally turn to resolve conflicts or disputes or to heal relationships, those people. That's where the laws come from. And then it also extends to relationship with territory, because many of our people have been disconnected from our lands, and that then impacts identity. So they said, well, we're going to find our kids where they are. We're going to meet them where they are. And we've had kids that were on like South Vancouver Island and other places in the province and even in Alberta and that who we've made connections with. And from there then to start to weave together the laws, the Nk'Ka'pamith laws. If they're placed, for example, we had one case where there was a non-Indigenous grandfather who had custody of the children, guardianship. And so we sat down with the elders and with the knowledge keepers, and we looked at the laws and said, well, how would we resolve that situation? Because he's not Nk'Ka'pamith, but in our ways then, what would we do? And what they said was, well, we would invite him then into the circle because he is related to those children. So the children can only benefit and be richer for those connections. So we'll adopt him. So it was kind of like a reverse, assimilation. He became assimilated. Yeah. And you know what? He started bringing them. He started bringing them to different events and what have you. So the way that this kind of works, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so what we did was we created a template for how we would work when we have to work with the ministry, when we work with other agencies. What does that look like to look at the whole child? When you're saying a cultural plan, it's a lot more than a paragraph or just identifying that we're going to let the kids, we're going to get them some books, and we're going to maybe send them to a camp once in a while. We looked at their identity and their culture. What does that really look like? We identified specific people who would then be in this circle and would sit together and stay in this circle until it was time. There would be 4 rounds that you go around the first time, just identifying what the challenges are, what are these monsters, and then going around again and saying, okay, well, what does this child and this family need? They need their identity, their culture, they need their language, they need that relationship with the land and relationship with others. And Ramona's back there, and she was really our guiding light when she said, the biggest thing we notice with our people is we don't need so much programs and services. We need those things, yes. But what we need are relationships. We need reconnection. We need to bring these people home. And we need to restore their sense of identity and who they are and those connections. So then we developed this cultural plan and hand that up, actually, as if we're in a court process, developed for each child, each family, and we identify specific people. They're named, they're committed, they are there for the length of any kind of issues, and often those relationships extend beyond any kind of issues when those issues are resolved. So that's sort of really in a very fast nutshell what this commandment is about. It's our children, and the children were involved in designing some of the things that you see here. The challenges we have obviously were capacity and funding. The Nk'Ka'pamith themselves had to do a lot of fundraising and continue. So when a case comes up now, we have to respond fairly quickly. And nobody cares where the money is. If there's no money, people just get together. So we invite in the circle like the social worker, the team leader, if there's psychologists, if there's doctors. We try to make sure there's no gaps. So it's weaving together a basket where not only the laws are, but the children sit in this basket and are surrounded then by all the resources and supports that they can and they deserve. We had some challenges identifying Nk'Ka'pamith children because they weren't identified in the ministry's own databases, right? So if they can't say that child is Nk'Ka'pamith, they could put unknown. So there's still a lot of work on that. Funding remains one of the biggest issues, but as I say, the Nk'Ka'pamith did some fundraising of their own to keep that project going. There is no funding currently for that project, but as I say, the circle comes together whenever there's a call. So it's not really depending on the funding. It depends on the best interest of the Nk'Ka'pamith child. And that's the other thing that we did was say, okay, so there's a best interest of the child in the act, but what does that actually mean for an Nk'Ka'pamith child, and what does that look like? And that's how we build the cultural plan and fill the basket. Yeah. Kilakisa.